On June 8th, Ukraine launched its long-awaited counteroffensive. On June 23rd, Russia's Wagner group staged an open rebellion. On July 10th, Turkey agreed to clear the way for Sweden's NATO membership. On July 12th, a day after the NATO summit, Biden declared in Helsinki that Putin's already lost the war. What does Biden mean by that? What do all these events tell us about what really is going on with the Ukraine war? Is the stalemate of the past year finally about to be broken? What does game theory tell us about what to expect next? What does it mean for investors? Hi, I'm David Wu, a former IMF economist and Wall Street strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about the big story shaping our world tomorrow. I don't know about you, but I love game theory. Game theory is the study of conflict and cooperation between rational decision makers. It is a powerful tool for predicting outcomes of strategic interaction between multiple players. In game theory, there are no good guys or bad guys. There are only good players or bad players. In other words, game theory is ethically or morally neutral. Game theory analyzes the results of people's actions given their motives. It doesn't care what these motives might be. For example, Putin says he invaded Ukraine to stop it from joining NATO. His motive is to stop Ukraine from joining NATO, and his action is the invasion. A game theorist does not care if Putin's motive is wise. A game theorist only cares whether his action is sound. In other words, consistent with his goal, especially given the likely responses of other players. One of the most famous games in game theory is the war of attrition game. In this game, the players balance the benefits of outlasting their opponents against the cost of holding out. Suppose there are two players competing for a single object. In the context of the Russian-Ukraine war, we can think of this single object as Ukraine's NATO membership. The conflict stems from the fact that Ukraine wants to join NATO, but Russia sees Ukraine's NATO membership as a threat to its own security. This characterization of the conflict is consistent with the fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine came exactly 1 month after the US affirmed the right of Ukraine to join NATO in January 2022. Justified or not, Russia fears that once Ukraine joins NATO, American missile launchers could be deployed directly on the Russian border. In the war of attrition game, a player can drop out at any time. Indeed, the game ends only when one of the players drops out and the other player gets the prize. Assume the value to both players for winning the prize is V, which stands for value, or in the Russia-Ukraine war, for victory. Furthermore, each player incurs a cost of fighting equal to C, for cost per unit of time. In one equilibrium, one player drops out immediately and the other one wins. We will not go into the math here, but there's another equilibrium called the mixed strategy equilibrium in which player 1 or player 2 exits with a probability of C divided by V per unit of time. What you can see in the equation is that the higher the cost, the higher the probability that the game will end sooner. However, the higher the value of the prize, the greater the probability that the game will go on longer. In the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, it is very clear that V is very high. This is because for Ukraine, joining NATO would mean a credible deterrent against Russian aggression. As for Russia, Ukraine's joining NATO is an existential threat to its security. Because V is very high, neither side has an incentive to exit the game quickly. This means, all being equal, the war will likely drag on for a very long time. But what about C? C being the cost of staying in the war. From the start of the war, the objective of the West, led by the US, has been to increase the cost to Russia for staying in the war in order to force it to quit. Indeed, the entire Western strategy can be seen in this light. Western economic sanctions have been designed to increase the economic cost for Russia. The Western policy of international isolation has been designed to increase the political cost for Russia. Western military aid has been designed to increase Russian military casualties, meaning the human cost for Russia. But the Russian economy so far has withstood the Western sanctions much better than expected. In 2022, the Russian economy shrank by only 2.1%, and the IMF is now forecasting it to grow by 0.7% this year. Russian seaborne oil exports recently reached their all-time high. The Western policy of international isolation has not only failed to isolate Russia, but it has actually helped strengthen the partnership between Russia and China, boosted the unity of the BRICS group, and increased calls in the global south for a transition to a multipolar world. However, there's no doubt that Western military aid to Ukraine has raised the cost of the war for Russia. If it weren't for Western weapons, Ukraine likely would have lost the war already. So where do we go from here? A long drawn out war of attrition? World War III? Which side will win? A lot has happened over the past month. Ukraine launched its long-awaited counteroffensive at the start of June. This was followed by the mutiny of Russia's Wagner group. And then there was the NATO summit this week. What does each of these three events tell us about the war of attrition game as it stands now? 1 month into the Ukrainian counteroffensive, there is no evidence that Ukraine has made any meaningful progress against Russian defenses. And this cannot be put down to lack of trying. If Zelensky chose to launch his counteroffensive in June, it was likely because he needed to show that Ukraine was capable of defeating the Russians at the NATO summit. Zelensky had been repeatedly told that to be considered for NATO membership, Ukraine needed to demonstrate that it could win the war. It is logical to think that Ukraine did pack a punch in its counteroffensive, and that its poor showing does not reflect well on its ability to break the stalemate. In other words, Ukraine, even with its German Leopard 2s, its American Bradleys, and British Storm Shadows, is not any closer to ending the war of attrition. But what about the Wagner mutiny? There is much we don't know about what exactly happened. What we do know is that the mutiny ended quickly, without bloodshed. What we do know is that days after the mutiny, Putin met for 3 hours with Prigozhin and the senior commanders of the Wagner group to hear their versions of the story and offer them employment opportunities. What we do know is that in the space of 2 weeks, the Wagner group has signed a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense and handed over its armored vehicles and ammunition. The mutiny and the firing this week of the commander of the Russian 58th Army could be signals that the internal disagreement in the Russian military leadership regarding the war's overall strategy is now boiling over. But it is important to understand that these voices of dissent are not against the war. To the contrary, they're in favor of a tougher approach, a more aggressive stance in the war. The fact that these voices are getting louder does not tell us anything about Russia's staying power in the war. In our war of attrition game, the mutiny of the Wagner group does not imply an increase in the cost to Russia for staying in the war. All it tells us is that some Russians are running out of patience and that Moscow may be under pressure to soon launch an offensive of its own. Indeed, given what happened at the NATO summit this week, I have to believe that the chance of a Russian offensive before the summer is over is very high. Why do I say that? On the surface, Zelensky came away from the NATO summit in Vilnius with nothing but empty promises. The joint declaration by NATO says no more than that NATO will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. But no conditions were set out and no timetable was given. On the surface, the NATO summit looked like a feel-good PR exercise for member countries. Yet, 3 important messages came out of the NATO summit if you listen carefully. 1, the declaration that Ukraine's future is in NATO was meant as an unequivocal message to Russia about NATO's commitment to Ukraine's membership. The fact that the declaration runs counter to some of the proposals coming out of Europe lately suggests that the hawks, i.e. the neocons in the Biden administration, are still in the driver's seat. 2. NATO is no longer shy about acknowledging that it sees the Ukraine war as a proxy war between NATO and Russia. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, was asked by reporters at the summit if he's worried the Ukraine package places the West closer to a direct war with Russia. This was his answer. He said there is no risk-free option, but the biggest risk is if Russia wins the war. He said it will be a tragedy for Ukraine if Putin wins, but it will be dangerous for us. It will make us more vulnerable. The message here is that if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, the rest of the world will be vulnerable. I will leave it to you to judge how a country whose economy is the size of Italy can threaten Europe, let alone the whole world. What is very clear is that Western leaders facing growing war fatigue at home have decided to persuade their voters that Russia is coming after them next. In our war of attrition game, war fatigue is increasing the political cost to politicians for their continued support for Ukraine. Apparently, their response is playing up the stakes of the war, namely the value of the price V in our equation. This portrayal of Russia as a global threat provided the rationale for the decision of the G7 countries to engage in negotiations with Ukraine on bilateral, long-term security commitments and arrangements. It was announced that the negotiations will start immediately. The idea is that long-term security commitments and arrangements will be more difficult to reverse in the future, even when governments change. Of course, long-term commitments and arrangements will still have to be adopted by the representative bodies in each of these countries. But the intention conveyed by NATO is very clear. It is preparing for a long fight. What do all these developments over the past month add up to? What do they tell us about what to expect next? Does this mean that the war will drag on for years to come? Russia is no stranger to wars of attrition. It resorted to a war of attrition to defeat Napoleon. It forced Hitler into a war of attrition that arguably cost Germany World War II. But can Russia win a war of attrition against Ukraine that enjoys unlimited money and supplies from all of NATO? It is no secret that Putin has been waging a war of attrition that minimizes Russian casualties to maintain public support at home. His cautious instinct might keep him on this course. However, he is facing growing pressure at home to go on the offensive. The triumph of the hawks at the NATO summit means Ukraine's military capabilities will only get stronger over time. It was announced this week that Ukrainian pilots will begin to receive F-16 training in August. Putin might decide that he needs a decisive victory before the winter to force a settlement, or at least greatly diminish Ukraine's fighting capabilities. Russian reports suggest Ukraine has already sustained heavy casualties that will be difficult to replace. And there's even agreement that Ukraine and the West are now running low on ammunition. So what will Putin do? I don't know. A tough call. But sometimes in wars, you have to take risks. As T.S. Eliot said, only those who risk going too far can possibly find out how far they can go. Let me know what you think by posting your comments on the video. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the bell so that you will receive a notification when the next video comes out. If you want to learn more about my investment strategy, come visit us at davidwunbound.com. Thank you for listening.